Good morning and welcome to day 2 here at South by Southwest EDU. Our first guest is the CEO of TNTP, and before that spent nearly a decade working with Memphis City Schools. Please welcome Tequilla Brownie to the studio.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hey Tequilla. So I'm really curious about these programs. TNTP programs address educational inequities, which has been a really big topic at this conference so far. What are the biggest inequities these days, and what programs are making the biggest difference?
Yes, so there are unfortunately a lot of inequities in education, and in TNTP's history, we worked with districts and schools and leaders all over the country to make sure that children, especially children from poverty and Black and brown children, are actually given an opportunity and a chance to even have access to the type of learning that will actually allow them to be on a pathway for economic and social mobility and escape the poverty and the conditions that they might have been born into.
Specifically, what kind of programs?
So one of the things that we do, we're a 25-year-old organization, and we actually were founded by teachers in 1997. And then in our first iteration, we were focused on making sure that all children had access to great teachers. Because if the research and what we found is that children from poverty often didn't have good teachers and didn't have effective teachers. So we started there. And in the evolution of our organization, we've been focused on everything from making sure that kids not only have great teachers, they actually get access to good learning and good instruction, and making sure that we're developing the teachers and developing the principals to be able to deliver on that promise. What I love is that we work at scale. We work at every aspect of the system, from everything from talent, academics, community engagement, policies, and advocacy, to make sure that we're all working really hard to have greater outcomes for all students.
That is a huge undertaking when you put it that way. So for somebody who might not know, what does TNTP stand for?
So our name is officially TNTP. Our original name was the New Teacher Project, which is, as I said, our foundings and our history was on training and developing new teachers. We do so much more than that now, and so we rebranded officially as TNTP a few years ago.
I like it. It sounds kind of explosive.
Yeah, that's what we hope.
So TNTP is part of 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign to increase the number of educators of color. What are some of the keys to convincing people of color to consider teaching, and specifically, how do you get Black men teaching, since they're only 2% of the teaching force?
So 2 things I would say, and I don't want to assume that everybody knows why that even matters. The research shows, though, that when students have access to teachers that look like them, particularly when students of color have access to teachers that look like them, they're more likely to be referred to gifted programs. They're more likely to actually even graduate from high school and graduate from college. So it has a correlation to actual outcomes. Myself included, I had teachers that looked like me and from kindergarten, and fortunately that served me well. One of the things that we know to be true is that there are adults within the communities of our students who are interested in teaching and might be interested in teaching. And unfortunately, if you look at the numbers and if you look at traditional College of Education programs, they are predominantly white. And so we're doing a disservice, and we're not doing a good job of tapping into the very communities of our students, this pool of potential teaching candidates. And so I think one way to think of how we can increase those numbers is, first of all, to set clear goals and be very intentional about recruiting them, and then supporting them through that. One of the things that we found in talking to community members and even students on college campuses and even HBCUs is that they would consider teaching the earlier you get to them. The students today, the young adults today, are really focused on social justice, and so helping them to understand that education, which is purported to be the great equalizer in our country, even though it's not right now, that is social justice work. And so when you connect those dots for students, for college students, and for young adults, it sort of unlocks for them the potential of what a career as a teacher could be. Now, I don't want to gloss over the fact that we need to do a much better job as a country in elevating the profession, in paying teachers well, and supporting them. And so that really matters for all teachers, but particularly when you think about educators of color who often finish college with higher debt. So there's that undue burden that many educators of color experience. Then once they get into schools, they find that the culture is not, conducive and welcoming. And so there are lots of things that we can do both to remove barriers on the front end so that more teachers and more candidates choose teaching as a field. And then we also have to do those same things and even more on the back end to retain teachers of color.
I personally believe teachers should get all of their school debt relieved because they are doing something for the whole community by being teachers. They should have no student debt. I'm running on that. Okay. What are some of the inequities that don't get enough media or public attention?
One of them that I would say that we overlook, one of the things I would say that dates back to probably even 1965 when President Johnson passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, when we tried to really focus on, this notion of access and making sure that we were giving all students access to the type of opportunities that would serve them well. We know that our country has, a long history, unfortunately, of tracking and some policies that actually sort of had a predetermined path for Black and brown students. And so in our efforts to undo some of that, what we ended up doing was actually alienate and cut off the multiple pathways to economic mobility for some students in our efforts to course correct for that legacy of racism, right, that was inherent in some of our systems. And so what we find now is that systems don't change behavior. You need policies and good equitable systems in place, but you have to also in parallel address the underlying mindsets that perpetuate those. And so the example I have is that, yes, we did away with tracking and all those things. The unintended consequence, as I said, was we cut off some of those multiple pathways for economic mobility for lots of students. But the underlying thing there of some of the racism and the just in bias that were inherent, they still were there. And so in our research at TNTP, the Opportunity Myth, where we actually studied expectations, which actually shows you a glimpse of what type of mindset some of the educators have, we actually found that too many adults still had low expectations for students. So big policy shift away from tracking, those low expectations were still in place. And that doesn't get talked about a lot. And that means that adults are making choices every day on behalf of students with that low expectations mindset in place.
Oh, that's
and we don't talk about that enough.
That is heartbreaking.
It is.
Because one thing that I know from kids is that they are so much more mature than we think they are, and we always underestimate them. So what inequities did the pandemic highlight and what did it exacerbate? I mean, with reopenings and remote learning.
Yeah, so we were actually, fortunately part of a lot of work to help schools plan for, reopening right after the pandemic. And looking at sort of how districts were thinking about it, we quickly figured out that a lot of schools were going to be focused on remediating kids, basically say the same thing and say it louder.
Yeah.
And so our efforts really focused on highlighting learning acceleration, which basically just means that you give students access to the content that they need just in time to keep moving forward, rather than going back and reteaching everything, because that's holding kids back, right? It's not helping them actually catch up. And so what we found is that we've done, some research with ZERN and other organizations, and have found that, in fact, too many Black and brown students and too many poor students actually experience remediation, not acceleration. So instead of us capitalizing on the moment and using strategies and tools to give them, the learning, that unfinished learning that they did so that they could move forward, we remediated them and just sort of repeated the same things. And those kids are held back. And the research is showing that happened with more Black and brown kids than it did more affluent and white children. The other thing that the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated is which schools have teachers. I mean, everybody is talking about the teacher shortage right now, but guess what? The schools that are experiencing the greater struggles with teacher shortage are in fact some of our high poverty schools that have mostly Black and brown students. And so that inequity that's inherent it's not new, but it has been further exacerbated during the pandemic.
Further exacerbated, maybe more of a light shining on it so that we actually can address the problem.
Hopefully, if we're smart and if we focus on addressing it, and by that I mean we can't gloss over it and say, oh, and let it continue to be acceptable that we continue to underinvest in some of the schools where we need to invest even more in order to sort of stabilize and level the playing field.
So there's countless challenges in education today. Given the limits on funding, how do you decide when and where to target your resources?
So I'm a school social worker by training. So even I'm a leader now, I lead TNTP, but I don't say this lightly, but the definition of insanity is doing the same thing, right, over and over and getting the same results. And so we're at this point in time where there is no one silver bullet. I want to be clear. The problem, I think, with ed reform is that we've pretended that there are silver bullets. And so we start one thing, oh, new silver bullet, shiny object, and we go all in on that one thing. The truth of the matter is that it's going to take multiple silver bullets, but we have to be very clear on what's working and what's not. But first, it starts with agreeing on a new destination. This ambiguous readiness that we, are focused on, college and career readiness, it's fairly abstract, and it's not leading us to multiple pathways explicitly helping students get to economic and social mobility. So we've got to redefine our destination to that education leads kids to multiple pathways for economic and social mobility, and then help them get there. So these random silver bullets that we, introduce that aren't getting to that, we can't continue to invest in those things. So it's going to take a lot of work collectively for us to step back and figure out what helps that, rather than, I would say, a lower hanging target of, oh, let's reduce the pipeline to prison. Like when people ask me that, I'm like, oh, so your goal for your own child is just to help them not get to prison? Really?
Right?
And so that's our lofty goal for Black and brown kids? No, we have to have a higher expectation of ourselves, right, as adults and as leaders to help children get where they need to.
I love that. Teacher burnout and retention are huge issues right now, especially right now. How to recruit the next generation of teachers. What is TNTP doing to address the issue of burnout?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When I talk to people, teaching is a profession. It's a career. And so there's something perverse almost in how we think about teaching as if it's only a heart, career. The truth of the matter is that in our country, all industries are really struggling with rethinking how to have a viable workforce. Education is no different. We need to rethink how we are going to ensure the next generation of teachers. That means everything from rethinking the role of the teacher. I mean, we demand and ask a lot of teachers. Exactly. And so like other industries who are rethinking what skills and things are needed to support their workforce, we in education have to do the same thing. We're not immune to the pandemic. And so if we continue with our old models, which are, decades old, right, and approach teaching as this one size fits all, one pathway, we're not going to get there. Other industries are thinking more innovatively around what competencies and what skills are required. That opens up multiple pathways. There are a lot of, employers now that are not even requiring a college degree. Now, am I saying that's where we should go as teaching? Maybe, maybe not. But what I am saying is we certainly need to rethink what skills actually will help a teacher be successful and actually help us open up that pathway so that the pipeline of teachers can be expanded.
I remember there was a certain point in tech where tech companies were going outside the box, not looking for necessarily big college degrees, but they were looking at things like pro skateboarders because they have resilience and they land every trick. And I always thought that was very cool that they're looking for their workforce in like a more creative way.
Totally. Do you know who my first teacher was?
Who?
I grew up in the South, in the Bible Belt. My Sunday school teacher. Didn't have a degree, taught me a lot in that aspect. And so when we've done our work at TNTP and sort of talking to communities and trying to figure out how to expand the pipeline, there are adults in communities, some already have degrees, some don't, but they actually have a desire and some foundational skills that will help them actually become, with training, really good teachers. And so we're actually looking at innovations and programs in that way. And the best thing is that those things end up becoming becoming two generational strategies, right? Where you're helping the adults in the community and you're helping the children as well.
That's some forward thinking. I like that. So how do we ensure teacher quality and value for a profession?
I think one of the ways that we do that is first and foremost is to treat it as a profession. And by that I mean, this was my earlier comment, that teaching is not just this hard mission-driven, job. It is a career that deserves dignity, that deserves requisite pay, and that deserves every development, all of the best practices that other industries, right, are adopting to make sure that their talent and their workforce is supported and retained. And again, education is not immune to the great reshuffle that our whole nation is experiencing right now by way of its workforce.
So you've talked about the importance of having teachers and administrators who look like their students and how that leads to higher graduation rates and success. Do you have any specific statistics? I'm a numbers person. I like the data.
Yeah, so what we have found is that when students actually have 2 or more teachers that look like them, that's when you start to see the numbers really shake out and see higher rates of graduation, of access to gifted programs and things like that. And so in our work, we've actually seen, if you look, I think the majority of our workforce, and if you look at the numbers, we did a report called The Broken Pipeline. If you look at the numbers and the gaps of like where the number of teachers of color represents or mimics the student population, it's wide and it's continuing to grow. And at our current trajectory, we will never close that gap.
Wow. Okay, so your personal story is very inspiring. You came from Arkansas, and I'm wondering, what would you, as an adult, go back and say to little Tequilla Brownie?
I think the adult me would go back and say, how can you bring others with you? And by that I mean, my story is the exception, right? Like, there are a few other people, from my community who education was the great equalizer for them, but there are far too many where it wasn't. And so the adult me would go back and try to figure out how to make sure that students like me had not only the academic experience that I was able to have, but how they were able to also have some of those, what we think of as enrichment experiences that actually helped me, like access to social capital, having access to, intrusive advising, even as a child. That's a new phenomenon for us, relatively new now. I had intrusive advising from adults around me from childhood. And those are the types of things I would make sure that other kids had from day one. And so thinking forward, those are the types of things that kids need now. Again, I am so proud. I had a wonderful K-12 experience in my little rural town in Arkansas. But I grew up at a time in Arkansas where former President Clinton was actually the governor for most of my childhood life. And what's interesting is that in Arkansas, which is made up of a lot of rural communities, the communities didn't always have the resources to make sure that kids had not just the 3 R's, right, but more of those enrichment and social capital and enrichment experiences that you needed in order to, alongside good academics, to be successful. So from the governor's office, there were tons of initiatives and programs and camps that gave me access to those things outside of the classroom that I needed, like leadership, like social capital, to help me be successful. I would go back and try to figure out how to make sure more kids were able to take advantage of those types of programs.
Well, now that we know that, what messages do you think that little girl would give back to you, Dr. Brownie?
I think that little girl would give back to me a message of hope. I'm new in my role as a CEO, running an organization. We have over 800 staff, great staff, diverse staff from all parts of the country with different lived experiences. And so it is so important to understand what motivates people and how to, inspire them and give them hope at a time when, as you know, our country is facing a lot of challenges. And so little girl Tequilla would tell adult Tequilla don't lose that vision and don't lose sight of that hope, because I know personally what education can do for a child.
I'm thinking that little Tequilla would probably be pretty stoked to see where she's going to end up. She ended up quite a fantastic woman.
And again, in part because of a fabulous, strong K-12 experience and the other, supports and access to social capital and advising from the adults around me. Those two things were absolutely true.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much for coming and talking to me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So thanks for being here, and thank all of you for watching. And thanks to those of you who are coming to the conference and being here for all of these incredible conversations. Stay tuned for more of South by Southwest EDU Studio. And in case you want to see the complete interview schedule, it is at southbysouthwestedu.com/studio. And you can find all of our studio interviews on the South by Southwest EDU TV app, available on Apple TV, Roku, Android TV, and Amazon Fire. Thank you.